welcome to Cruising Through History. I am Xander Miller. I am sitting down here with Scott Cruz. Scott, what are we cruising through today?
Well, today, Xander, I'm going to talk about something called Operation Mincemeat.
Okay, and does this have anything to do with any edible meat? Okay.
It's probably kind of not very edible once I start talking about it, but it was an operation that was designed to deceive the Germans about where the Allies intended to land in the Mediterranean. Now, the reason I thought of this is because there's a lot of stuff, a lot of people know about the deceptions that went into D-Day, like phony tanks and putting troops where in the south of England where it looked like they were going to attack in one place, but they attacked in another. This was sort of earlier than that. This would have happened in 1943, and it was for Operation Husky, which was the Allied invasion of Sicily. So it was important to deceive the Germans as to where the Allies were actually going to land. Now, there's nothing really that special about deception. It's been going on in warfare forever. It's what they did to do it that kind of makes mincemeat stand out a little bit.
Does that have anything to do with why it's called mincemeat?
No.
Okay.
I think I did see where it said mincemeat was just a name from a list of names. They picked it sort of out of a hat and called it that. But there's a lot of, when you read this stuff about espionage and stuff, there's so many different operations going on, you sort of have to keep them straight, and there's a lot of people involved.
So that's why you get unique names.
That's why they get unique names, right? In fact, Operation Mincemeat was a small part of something called Operation Barclay, which was a whole bunch of plans to deceive the Germans. It included having fake divisions in North Africa in certain places. There was one thing called Operation Animal, where the British were in Greece, and they were sort of having partisans destroy railroads and things like that to make it look like, and that's what they were doing. The deception was to kind of tell the Germans, we're going to either do it in Greece or Sardinia. Now, if you know the Mediterranean, Sardinia is west of Italy. It's a little northwest of Sicily. Mm-hmm. And it's not helping our listeners that I'm doing this with my hands and pointing at things because you can't see me. So, yeah, and so it was either going to be those two places, and they wanted to make Sicily look like it was not the place they were going to land. They wanted to make Sicily look like the other one. So,
like just whatever, Sicily's not a big deal. That's what they wanted.
Right. And so they wanted to make it look like more so to invade Greece and then go through the Balkans into Europe. Hitler knew that they were going to come, after the Operation Torch, which were landings in North Africa, Hitler knew that they were going to somehow try to come through somewhere in the Mediterranean, whether it was Italy, Greece, Sardinia, and then just go from there. Mm-hmm. So they came up with this plan. Now, the background of this is interesting. I suppose I should say in mincemeat, the biggest part of mincemeat was the use of a corpse to fool the Germans into finding documents that would sort of say, we're attacking in Greece or Sardinia. So I guess I should have mentioned that at the top. That's why I said it's probably not very edible.
Okay. A corpse not very edible at all.
No.
Unless you're trying to find out war plans.
Yes. So the genesis of this was a memo written in 1939 by a man named John Gottfried, who was the head of naval intelligence, and he wrote what was called the Trout Memo. And the reason he called it that was because he likened deceiving the enemy to fly fishing. Now, his assistant, there was a book called Operation Mincemeat by Ben McIntyre, and McIntyre writes that this person, he mostly wrote the memo. Now, it's interesting that his assistant was Ian Fleming.
Wait, my name recognition's popping up. Remind us, who's Ian?
Ian Fleming was the man who wrote all the James Bond novels. And so in this memo, this Trout Memo, which was written mostly, as historians have sort of who have studied this think that it was mostly written by Ian Fleming. Mm-hmm. Number 28 was a idea. It's buried in there to plant fake documents on a corpse so that the enemy would find it. Now, planting fake documents on things was never that big of a deal. It was called the haversack ruse.
Mm-hmm.
But usually it was you'd leave it like in a haversack or some kind of backpack or something, just throw it on the ground and figure it would be found.
Yeah.
Or it's sort of a little like when the plans for Gettysburg were found wrapped around cigars. This was more elaborate. But it wasn't done by, what's interesting though is even though the kernel of the idea was there were little things that led up to it because it didn't really happen until 1943. Now that memo was written in 1939.
Yeah, that's 4 years time.
Right, so there was some lag, but there were a few things that happened in between time. One was there was a crash off the coast of Spain that had killed a British soldier, not officer, and a French agent, and they had documents on them. But they were returned by the Spanish to the British, and they just returned them unopened. But then they had the idea, but there's a lot of Germans in Spain, because Spain was supposed to be neutral, but as we know from pre-World War II, with the Luftwaffe assisting Franco, and the nationalists, and bombing of Guernica, and that whole story. So there were a lot of German agents running around Spain. A lot of German sympathizers were in Spain, too, even though Spain was technically neutral. They thought, I wonder if we did this, because this soldier had documents on, and he was floating in the water.
Yeah, so you get an idea of like, oh wait, maybe.
And during Operation Torch in North Africa, they planted some phony documents. An officer was killed in the car had exploded, and they knew the Germans used it because when the Germans went to attack, it rerouted them into this field where all their tanks sort of sunk in the sand.
Oh yeah, it's just like use the environment against it.
Right. So then we fast forward. We have two guys named. One is named Charles, and I'm hoping to pronounce his name right because it's for a British name. It's kind of long. It's Charles Cholmondeley, who was a Royal Air Force officer, but he worked in intelligence, and then the Navy assigned a guy named Evan Montague to work with him. And this Cholmondeley, I'm pretty sure I'm probably butchering his name. He was also working on something that was similar to this Trout memo.
Yeah.
Later, he called it the Achaean something or other. That's from the Peloponnesian War. It's from the Trojan War. That's what the Greeks were called. I won't go into that because that's a whole different.
That's another area of history we could get into.
Right. So that's why he called it that. So they actually got it. They got approval from Churchill and Eisenhower to go ahead with this idea.
Mm-hmm.
But what they did was they really were thorough in how they did this. And so, of course, I guess the next question someone would ask is, where did they get a body from?
Yeah, that I was about to ask, like, who's the lucky fella that got to deceive the armies by, well,
first Montague had gone and worked with a pathologist because they were trying to figure out, okay, we need a corpse though, but it's got to look like it's, like what they noticed if they did a autopsy in Spain, that this guy didn't drown. Now they're going to pull him out of the water. You'd expect drowning, but this pathologist said, well, there's depending, the lungs could have started decomposing and there could be seawater in them, but I don't think it's enough where they're going to think this is a phony. They didn't die this way. So they went and they talked to a guy named Purchase was his last name. He was the coroner for the North District of London. And of course, the whole time though, I was talking about this with some of my colleagues in my department, kind of just rehearsing a little bit.
Yeah. And
the whole time, every time I'm reading this, I'm thinking, not once did anybody stop and say, is this kind of the ethical thing to do?
Because people can be organ donors, but not many people really sign up to be deemed an operation in wartime.
And this coroner, it said, listen, we have plenty of bodies, but you're going to need a body that won't be claimed by a family.
Oh, true.
You can't have someone coming in. If you're going to use a body, it's got to be. There are certain things you have to, you have to think. So, I think in 42 they were working on this a bit, and then early 43. So then they did find a body of a man named Glyndwr Michael. Now, he's Welsh, and so his name is spelled Glndwr, so I actually had to look up the pronunciation.
Yeah, because this is probably not
like
what you
Gour.
expect.
And so he was a Welshman. His father had committed suicide when he was like 15.
Mm-hmm.
His mother had died, and he had no family or friends, so he drifted to London, where he lived mostly as, well, they called him a tramp, but I'm guessing he was homeless.
Yeah.
And he died from eating rat poison. He was about 34.
Just purposefully? Or?
Well, they don't know, because he had eaten a piece of bread that had it smeared on it, like in a paste, but they think he was so hungry that he found this bread. Someone had put it out for rats, and he ate it, and that's what killed him. So they said, hey, I think we have a body for you. And so they went and got it, and it looked like it would serve its purpose.
Well,
now, we didn't know who this guy was until 1996.
Really?
Ewan Montague, who's kind of a character in this whole thing, in 1953, he wrote a book called The Man Who Never Was, and it was about this very thing, but he said he would never name this person. Although he didn't have a lot of good things to say about him. He called him like a ne'er-do-well who did more in death than he ever did in his life, and I think, well, it's not like he gave him a choice. So, and Montague had a couple of big fibs in his book. I won't say lies, that might be, but he had claimed that the guy had died from pneumonia, which wasn't true. He also claimed that he got permission from the family to do this.
What family, though?
Well, that's why I don't even know why you'd have to even tell. Now, this was 1953, so this was not long after the war, and so I don't know why those two things were never true anyway. Mm-hmm. So no one really knows why he said that. There was no family. So the coroner called him and said, we think we have somebody for you, and so they did. So then you have a body. Well, now you got to start making it look like he was a British officer.
Well, yeah, that's the challenge, because to me that sounds like they have to do so much, because different army divisions, like different people make them up. Like if I recall, at least from American troops, that was still had segregated troops at the time for a lot of World War II. Right. So it's like you have to make it so everything matches up.
That's
and I'm
right.
guessing this guy didn't really have a military trained body.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because it was the coroner who said, this guy is never going to pass for an officer.
Yeah.
Look at take out the fact that he's been dead for 3 days. Look at his condition. But then the coroner had an idea. He thought, well, you know what? Make him a staff officer, a guy who worked at a desk a lot, because then he could just be out of shape because he worked at a desk. I know I am. So all the time. So, but they came up with they had to make what was called a legend for him, which is a backstory basically. Mm-hmm. So they named him, and this is where it gets confusing for me, because I kept calling him the wrong name when I was doing this, because his name is Michael, his last name, but then they called him. Good job, Scott. They called him William Martin. So I kept calling Glendor Michael Martin, because that's what his name was. So this all got confused.
Yeah.
And they made him a captain, but like an acting major or something like that. And they made his rank just low enough where he'd have access to things, but you couldn't be checking on. No one would know who he was. Mm-hmm. He was sort of in the middling ranks of officers, but he still would sort of have some access to. So they made his rank that way too. And so they made up this legend, this backstory, and then they did, in espionage circles, they gave him a lot of what's called pocket litter, which is like what people would carry around, photos of people. And so
so like they made his own family or memorabilia that he would carry around for, like a soldier would have their mementos they carry with them.
Yes, so they said, well, we'll give this guy a fiance. So a clerk who worked in MI5, her name was Leslie, I think was her last name. She posed for photographs, like at the beach and this other stuff, so she was the fiance. Mm-hmm. Well, then they had another problem. They said, well, we can't give this guy brand new ID cards if he's been in the service for 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
So they made cards, and then they took a picture of the actual corpse. That didn't work. You could clearly tell it was not good.
Yeah.
So another so they got an officer from MI5, and he posed for the photos. And so they took the photos, and then they explained that part about being new away by saying these were replacements for lost.
Mm-hmm.
But they also kind of would scuff them on their pants to kind of make them look like they were beat up.
Well, yeah, because it's not like there's going to be like high-tech photo restoration at this point in time, and you're not going to cross-check Google
and even right,
for,
and even
for it.
Even his clothes, I think it was Clomondi or Montague. One of them was sort of the same size.
Mm-hmm.
So they got the clothes, and he was actually, they put him in like the Royal Marines, and the reason they did that because they thought that any inquiries that came in would be funneled to naval intelligence. So they knew this was going on. So
yeah.
Of course, so one of them wore the uniform for like 3 weeks to kind of make it look like it was worn, before they put it on him.
Mm-hmm.
And they kept the body refrigerated. I guess that question would come up too, like, well, this is taking a while.
Because that came up when you said it's like they took pictures of the body. How are they preserving the body?
Well, they knew that they had to keep it at 39 degrees Celsius because if they made it any colder and it froze, if they defrosted that body, any pathologist would see that it was froze, and then they'd know, well, this body wasn't in the water, it was froze. So then they got a couple of there were a lot of higher ups working in this. So then they got some guys to actually write things about, here's, get ready to clear out here because this is where we're going to land. And they even made a joke about sardines, thinking the Germans pick up on it, Sardinia. And so there were things in there from a British general who had written them. He was supposedly writing these documents to to Alexander, who was in North Africa. And so they wrote it up like that, like it's going to happen here, and that. But then they did a couple of things that were interesting because they didn't know if the Spanish would actually go through with it and show these documents to the Germans. So in this letter, they put an eyelash and they just dropped it in there and sealed it up. And so they did that, but they also gave him a briefcase because they didn't want to they were afraid that if you tucked these documents inside a pocket, like inside a coat jacket, the Spaniards would miss them.
Yep.
So they said, so we're going to give him a briefcase and chain it to his like trench coat. So it looks like it's really important, like it can't be stolen off of him.
That seems so suspicious. Like I'm hearing that and I'm like, if I see a briefcase on somebody, like first thing I'm going to think is like, is that a trap? Like that's what I'm thinking.
Well, you would have thought that because this, like I said, this happened once before, not deliberately, but with that plane crash off the coast of Spain, but it wasn't. So then they had to come up with, where do we put this body? So they thought maybe the west coast of Spain, just above Portugal there. But then they went and talked to some hydrographers. Hydrography, it's the waves, it's that.
So like if they put a body in the water, it'll wash up somewhere. That's what you mean?
Yes. So how the tides would carry it.
Yeah.
So they decided on a place called Huelva, Huelva, which is the southern Spain, but just on the Atlantic side there through the Straits of Gibraltar there. And so they decided there because also the British Vice Consul lived there. So he could be involved in this too. And also there was a German agent that was in that region. His name was Claus, like Santa Claus, but not quite as jolly. So they thought, well, we'll send him there and they'll find him and then all these things will be in motion. So they get to the day, they dress him up, well, now you're thinking, okay, we've got those things covered.
Yeah.
Well, how did he get in the water? How's this going to happen?
Yeah,
we just can't like fly over and throw a body out into the water.
See, I've been thinking this whole time, this is like in a random field somewhere, and I'm just like, wait, how did that get there? What's the story there? Now they're getting to that point of how does this guy get in the water?
Right, and so they decided, well, we're going to have him like be an air crash. And so they were thinking of, well, how do we set this up? With flares? Do we blow up the water? I mean, how does this work?
Yep.
Well, then they thought all that was impractical. So here's what they were going to do. So they decided we're going to deliver this body by submarine. So now you've got an issue where, okay, you're not just going to take this body dress up of a British officer and sit him in a submarine like Weekend at Bernie's or something.
Yeah, you've got to, well, you have to get the submarine. If they're like, is he a submarine?
So
what happened to the sub?
So here's what they did. I think they consulted some engineers or whatever, and they came up with this idea of building a container for the body where you could put like dry ice in it and it would preserve it. And the only ones who were really in on it were the officers of this sub. None of the enlisted men who were serving on the sub knew about this. And so they built this, I guess, casket. I don't know what else to call it. So they built this container, put the body in, and away they went. And about 4:30 in the morning off the coast of southern Spain, they surfaced, and they took the body out of the container and chucked it in the water. I shouldn't say chuck, that makes it sound so trivial, but like they were throwing bodies all over the place. But I had that vision in my head for some reason. And so body goes in, and there it sits. So they thought, okay, well, here's what we'll do. We'll use the propellers from the sub to send it towards the shore, because it's gotta get there eventually, or at least close to it. And then it was even fun. It almost became kind of comical, because then they were trying to destroy this container they had made. They're riddling it with bullets. Nothing's working. It's not sinking. So finally, they just put plastic explosives on it and blew it up, because you couldn't have proof, right?
Right.
So
that would also maybe serve as debris that could wash up, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
You didn't really want that, because. So they had it all set, and sure enough, I believe it was April 30th, 1943, Spanish fisherman just out in the morning, seeing what he could catch, and there he was in the water. So they brought him out, and of course, the British Vice Consul, who was in on this whole thing, was involved. And so, of course, they had already had these pre-scripted diplomatic dispatches they were sending back and forth from London to there. And then they made sure to say, get the briefcase, it's very important. And the reason they said that is because they knew, even though those dispatches were encoded, they knew the Germans had broken the code. So they knew the Germans would see that it said, get the briefcase. Now, at first, the Spaniards weren't going to turn the briefcase over to the Germans. It's only as it worked its way up, and it finally ended up in Madrid, along with these other documents in an envelope, that they said the Germans were finally, in fact, they had to call Wilhelm Canaris, who was the head of the Abwehr, which is the intelligence unit for the German army. They finally called him and said, can you kind of persuade the Spanish to share this stuff with us? Because they're not doing it. And finally they did. And they made copies of it, put the letter back in, carefully sealed it, which, I don't know, anybody could see that it was tampered with. Well, they kept the seal intact, so I guess they thought they could do somehow that. And so they send it back to this British Vice Consul, and he sends it on to London for forensic examination. And lo and behold, they opened the letter and no eyelash, so they knew that they had read it, or at least copied it. And some German sympathizers already had copied it in some other stop on its way to Madrid.
So the eyelash was really this, did it actually work?
Yeah, it seemed like when they got the letter back, the eyelash was missing, so they knew someone had opened the envelope at least. And they could also tell that the envelope had been tampered with, even though they tried their best to make it look like it wasn't. And also what kind of clinched it was in May, because, and some of our listeners might know about Ultra, which was the Bletchley Park thing that was going on. Alan Turing was working there, and they had cracked the Enigma codes.
Yeah, because that was Alan Turing's doing, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
So they already had these, so they could already decrypt these messages. And one of the messages that went back to Germany was, the invasion's going to happen in Greece. So they knew they had seen it.
Yep.
That confirmed it. And so, but yeah, it's such an interesting story that.
Well, it seems
there's like a million things that could have gone wrong, and somehow
exactly.
they didn't.
It's like that moment where you're getting, okay, how are we getting? It's like the needle in the haystack thing, but it's like you're trying to get a needle through a haystack, and there's so many different things stopping it. Like you're trying to go through all of that trouble? It seems almost too convoluted, and it's also.
And I'm surprised someone at some point didn't say, this is too good to be true.
Well,
There's
yeah.
something not right about this.
It seems like something out of a novel, which I mean, with
Right.
it originated.
And speaking of Ian Fleming,
yeah,
I just saw that there was a book about his time in naval intelligence and how it influenced all of his James Bond books. So I might have to check that out at some point. But I got about 1 million books I'm trying to read now.
As don't we all?
And I also saw that this year in 2022, they made Operation Mincemeat, based on Ben McIntyre's book, I'm guessing, into a movie. Colin Firth plays Ewan Montague. Sorry, not Ian. And so this story was not made. Now, with anything like of this nature, there are people who say, well, this Glendor Michael wasn't the guy. Mm-hmm. So now in the 2000s, you had guys saying, no, it was this guy. He died in a plane crash. They used him. And then somebody else said, no, it's this other person. Well, I just went with Glendor Michael because that's who the British government recognizes. And he's buried with full military honors as Captain William Martin.
Huh.
And they just left him in Spain because really he contributed to the war effort as well. And so
even as a dead person.
Even as a dead person. And so when Operation Husky started and they invaded Sicily, I think that was in July of 43, the Germans were kind of thrown off. Even on the day of the invasion, they were still sending reinforcements to Sardinia, just in case, because Hitler had this obsession with the Balkans. He thought that's where it would come through. And if you know Greece, it sits at the south, and then you go up north, and then you kind of turn. But that's not the way they went. They went from the bottom, and then the D-Day invasion went this way.
Yep.
And so they were going to meet there. And the Russians were coming from the east anyway. And so, but some historians say, well, it didn't really matter that much. Hitler already had sort of a Balkan obsession. He thought they were coming through there, so this just sort of reinforced it. And I think the ironic thing of all this is the man who was right was Mussolini, which Hitler always ignored. And at this time, Mussolini was on his last legs anyway.
Yeah.
But Mussolini kept telling Hitler, I think they're going to come through Sicily because of where it sat, how close it sits to North Africa, and then where the toe of Italy is. I know we use these in the boot, but where the toe is, it's like 40 miles across. It's not even that far. Mm-hmm. And so this was just part of the deception. And like I said, there were D-Day deceptions too. So, but this one just, because I think of the nature of the idea, it's so interesting. And but like I said, I mean, they even went to the labs at MI6 to get, I mean, now we're really into James Bond territory here, to get inks that wouldn't run. Because you didn't want to write something and then have it thrown in the water and then have it just get all smudged.
Yeah, it's like that thing of having a pen in space sort of deal. It's
right,
like,
and you had to make it look like I said, you had to make it look like it was just a written letter, communication. So they experimented with different inks to see which ones would not start running in the water. They came up with this ink that they wrote it out in, and they knew that it wouldn't smudge, so the information would be clear.
See, there's so many. This is like an overly detailed plan. Like this
it's almost like too overly detailed.
Like they thought of so many different things, but there's like the human error aspect isn't part of it. Like you'd expect, like you to throw in an error just because people are people, but it seems so perfect.
It just amazes me that no one thought that there was something phony about this.
Yeah.
I mean, you're right. It was almost too perfect, and it went even so far as to list Captain Martin in the June 4th edition of the London Times as a casualty. That way, if someone saw it, there wouldn't be like, oh yeah, he was in the area. And I guess there had been a couple of other plane crashes in that area that had killed a couple of airmen, and so it didn't seem out of the realm of possibility that would have happened.
Yeah.
But and I think so there's been arguments that, well, it didn't really matter because Hitler always thought they were going to come through Greece, so even this just sort of reaffirmed what he thought.
But still, it's part of the history.
It's part of the whole thing. And Operation Husky was very successful. In fact, it lasted half of the time they thought it would last. But of course, now the deception was over. So now the Nazis knew where you were going to come. So that's why taking Italy was not a cakewalk like they thought it would be, like Sicily was, because they could reinforce it, because now they knew where they were coming. So those deception things, they only work once.
Yeah.
And I was watching a thing on D-Day, and it was very similar. They didn't use a corpse, of course, but of course the Allies were bombing this area where they were trying to show the Germans, oh, we're going to invade here, so put all your resources here. They even bombed the area before the invasion to make it look like they were. So there was some precedent for this. So. But I just thought it was a very interesting story, and I don't think it's known that much. I mean, we know the whole D-Day deception with like I said, with the phony tanks and Patton with a phony army and all this other stuff, but not many people know about Mincemeat, which is a strange name, but but like I said, but reading about this, there were so many operations going on, I had to like start writing things down because I couldn't keep them straight in my head.
No. Just this one operation has tons of stuff to it.
Right, so it'll be interesting, especially when that movie comes. I did watch the trailer this afternoon before we did this, and it's got all the British actors you think are in there.
Of course,
like Dunkirk or something like that, or Churchill or something, So.
Yeah.
But it looked pretty interesting. But it's a very interesting situation, and like I said, I'm surprised it worked. I'm surprised someone didn't say, "Isn't this phony?" But if Hitler already had it in his head that Greece was going to be the place, then maybe it just was sort of a confirmation bias.
Yeah.
Maybe he didn't think, well, this is too good to be true. He just thought, oh yeah, well, that's what we thought anyway. So,
Yep. So wow.
Yes, very much so.
So Scott, that is a nice spice to stop in history.
Yes.
Where do you think we're going? We're going next.
Well, to stay on this great thing with bodies and corpses,
of course,
I thought next we'd talk about take a trip through the Black Plague.
Oh boy.
Of the 14th century, and because I was thinking of something along those lines, because I know we had done medical stuff when we did the mustard gas, but that's not like the Black Plague. But given the times we live in or whatever, so I'll be talking about the Black Plague, some aspect of it next time. So.
Yeah, sounds like it's gonna be fun.
Oh, it should be more rats, more corpses, so we got it going.
Okay, cool.